Okay, so this is the third session in the project management module. In this session, I'm looking at project definition, estimating, and a little bit around costs. We'll pick up that in detail in the next two sessions, in particular in session 5. But for now, we're just looking at estimating and project definition principally. Okay, so the reading for this particular session is chapters 4 and 5 from the textbook, plus a couple of references which I've got in the on the lecture slides. In terms of what I want you to think about, it is the iron triangle. What we really mean by the iron triangle. How rigid is it? How flexible is it? Okay, so the way I'm going to start this is with something called the project life cycle. So essentially, the project life cycle has a number of phases. This model is out of the textbook and shows 4 phases. Sometimes you might break them down into more or fewer, and the names vary from one reference to another, but this is as good as any. And you can see that essentially you have a definition stage at the beginning of the project, which overlaps with a planning stage, and the planning can carry on through the delivery stage, which is executing the project, and then at the end you have a closing down stage, which might happen in phases as well. So these stages can all overlap with each other, and this model you can see here is indicative. There's no hard and fast rule, and it varies from project to project and context to context. Okay, so in the defining stage, what we're doing is thinking about the goals of the project, the objectives, starting to put together some sense of the specifications, the key aspects which need to be delivered. Think maybe about some of the tasks which need to be achieved in order to deliver the project, and also who might be responsible for different parts of the project, what organisations, what functions within organisations, and maybe individuals. The planning stage, which we'll come on to in the next 2 sessions, we'll start looking at schedules, budgeting, resources, staffing, those sort of things, and then I'll take you through the other sections throughout the rest of the module. Okay, so we're in the defining stage of the project here. So the first thing to do is to think about the project concept. What do we mean by the project concept? So this is a strategic process. What we start by doing is talking about business need. What is the business need for the project? How does it fit into the overall organisation's activities? To what extent will it improve things, provide some sort of benefit to the organisation? So that's the starting point. I put business in inverted commas because lots of organisations, public sector as well as private sector, use this term business. For the public sector, the business is to deliver services and services to the public at large. For the private sector, obviously, the business is to improve the profits and underlying turnover and so forth for the organisation. Okay, so start with identifying the business need. Is there a business need? Will the project fit into the overall activities of the organisation? Once that's done, then an organisation for the project, we can start to think about the need for a program of projects in order to deliver that business need. Once that's been done, then we can think about feasibility. How feasible is the project? I put in brackets there when, a question, because the thing about feasibility is that at the outset, the project, the scope, scale, cost and so forth of the project will be very, very loosely defined, very vague. And so it's very difficult to say whether the project's feasible, because there'll be such a range of possible costs, possible durations for the project. As time goes on and more information is gathered about specific aspects of tasks and so forth, then more precise measures of cost and time can be established, and then more accurate feasibility assessments can be made. At some point we need to establish the project scope, so what's included and crucially what's not included, I'll come back to that in a moment. And then it's all about developing the project proposal and brief, and possibly putting into place procurement procedures for getting on board specific suppliers, consultants, and so forth. I said there is an iterative process, and for a lot of organisations it is an iterative process. As you go through this process, more and more information is gathered, and you can revisit the earlier parts of this process. Okay, now going back to the project life cycle, I talked about. I'd like to talk a bit about how organisations regard cash flow and time, and how these two elements link together in terms of project delivery. So here's a life cycle: appraisal, design, production or delivery, commission, handover. Okay, so as I said, the words can vary, but essentially you've got some sort of a series of activities along these lines in any project. At handover, that will be a project completion point, and the project will be handed over, the outcome of the project, be it a product or be it a building or whatever it is. So it's handed over and then goes into operation. So one of the points I'm trying to get across here is the distinction between project delivery and operational activity. Okay, so there's a series of project activities which get to the point of delivery. After that, the project goes into operational activity and becomes an operation. But there is a link between the project and the operation. So what happens in the project impacts upon the operation. Likewise, the way the operation is going to use the outcome of the project could impact on how that project gets delivered. At some point in the distant future, the project will be decommissioned. For example, a new product will be developed to replace old products, or a new building will be built to replace an old building, or whatever. Now, over time, throughout the project, all cash flow from the customer or client is negative. So they're basically spending money on commissioning the project, commissioning the project. So it's all negative cash flow. At handover point, when the project goes into operation, then the cash flow starts to become positive. And at a certain point, there will be a break-even point, where the amount of money, the cumulative amount of money spent on the project is outweighed by the income from the use of the project. Okay, so what are the objectives of the project? In the first instance, you need to think about how the project is going to be judged. Now, in the press and in discussions, often, and once the project's underway, often the way projects are judged is just through time, cost and quality, TCQ there, or time, cost, scope. That quality one can be broadened out much more widely, but essentially it's time, cost and quality. However, in reality, for organisations who are commissioning projects, it's about their strategic and operational objectives. What are they trying to achieve operationally, and how does that fit into the strategic objectives of the organisation? At some point, this will lead to a project specification which needs to be created and agreed. And I said, is there any ambiguity about what has to be achieved? The reality is there's almost always ambiguity. This is because nearly all projects have multiple stakeholders. And those different stakeholders have different needs or wants from the project. Another point I've put there is, are targets clear? In reality, targets almost always aren't clear. They flex and change over time. So there are a lot of questions there about the objectives, and yet at some point, someone somewhere has to decide what the objectives of the project are going to be, and then these get turned into some kind of project documentation, which often forms the contract for the project. Okay, so I mentioned feasibility. How do we go about feasibility? It's normally multiple stages. So there'll be a pre-feasibility stage, at the very early stage when we have very little information. At this point, the organisation will look to have a general overview, the business case and the different alternatives. As I said earlier, does a project even need to be used? might use project screening and project analysis grids, and there's a question the sponsoring organisation will ask itself: should it continue to invest resource? And the reason for that is that as the project progresses through the design and planning stages, the detailing stages, then the organisation is spending money, spending resource in terms of carrying out those early planning project activities. And as time goes by, more and more resource will be spent on the project. If they're not sure about the project going ahead, then that could be a whole load of wasted money on or wasted resource on designing and detailing the project. Later down the line, as more information is acquired, more planning is being done, more resource spent, then a more detailed feasibility study can be carried out. This is generally a more detailed plan for the project, and the subsequent operation of its outcome will be in place. It requires some assessment of resources and capital expenditures. The question with feasibility studies is, what level of detail are we going to go into? How much detail do we have available to us? How many times are we going to carry out the feasibility study? And do we have any idea really of what the budgets and costs are going to be? Okay, so then the next step in the defining process of the project is establishing the project scope. A point at which organisations start to put together a specific statement which gets reflected in the detailed planning of the project. So a scope statement is put together, establishes outline responsibilities normally, and becomes the basis for decisions and the planning process. Sort of things that you might include here are user acceptance requirements. So the project will be handed over and users will take over the operation of the project, and they will have certain basic requirements which need to be delivered in the project. The objectives will be normally included in the scope statement, maybe some high-level specifications, some outline specifications, possibly some ancillary items, additional things which might be included in the project. The main areas: key work, key activities which need to be undertaken, possibly even down to specific tasks, and key deliverables throughout the project. What needs to be done, then what needs to be done next, and so forth. And crucially, I've underlined it there, what isn't included in the project. So what is the project not expected to include as part of its activity? I've got another issue there in red. Do clients, the customer, the end users all agree and understand the scope statement? It's a question mark. Almost invariably, certainly in my research and my experience, almost always there's ambiguity here. There's never full understanding, never full agreement. Okay, so I talked earlier about the iron triangle, and it's the notion of an iron triangle, which suggests rigidity. Well, here's what I've got here, a triangle here. You've got time, cost, and quality, I've said, or specification, or function, or output, or outcome, whatever it wants to be, but it's some kind of deliverable. Okay, so, and in the middle there, flexing this, I've got scope. So at the design stage, or the planning, the early pre-planning stages of the project, these are going to be movable things. How long have we got to deliver the project? Maybe you want to fix that, maybe you don't want to fix that. What sort of budget have we got available to us? Maybe that's fixed, maybe it's not fixed. What sort of specification or output or something do we want the project to deliver? And these aspects of the project can be seen to encompass, I think, scope. Sometimes scope is listed as where the quality one is, but I prefer to see this as the triangle as encompassing or giving a boundary to scope. Scope creep is a real issue for projects and happens in the planning stages, in the delivery stages, and even in the handover stages. New things get added, extra bits need to be included, time expands, cost increases, what's going to be delivered increases, and so we end up with scope creep. Okay, so how does an organisation go about forcing or thinking about these different priorities? So we've got time, cost and quality, or time, cost and performance, or time, cost and function, whatever you want to call that quality stroke performance one. And an organisation needs to think about where its priorities lie. Ideally, if you were to ask anyone in project management, they want all three to be optimised. But the reality is we can't optimise them all. So to force priorities, what we do is we decide which criteria of the three can be constrained, or has to be constrained. That's it. That it's fixed and not changeable. Which one should be enhanced, optimised to add value, potentially, and which one can we accept some sort of shifting on, so we can tolerate it not meeting the original objectives. So what we end up with is, again, a movable thing. So I've got a couple of examples to illustrate this. The first example, imagine an organisation is developing a new IT project. So for this product, it might be time to market might be particularly important. So the time can potentially be enhanced. If we can reduce that time to market, so cut down on the time it takes to deliver the project, then that's a benefit. We are adding value to the organisation. In this one, we might say that performance is constrained in that it can't shift. It has to deliver certain benefits to the customers, to the consumer, and we can accept a little bit of shift maybe in cost, maybe increase the cost in order to reduce time and get better and ensure we've achieved our performance targets. So that might be one way of forcing priorities. Another example might be a new pharmaceutical product. Here, product performance might be critical. Okay, so the pharmaceutical product has to deliver certain benefits to the consumer. So here, performance is going to be enhanced. If we can get more benefits from this product, this drug or whatever pharmaceutical product it is, then that's excellent, adds more value to the product. We might say that cost is constrained. We have a certain amount of money we can spend on this, any more than that, and we're never going to get a return on the product. And then we decide maybe that we can accept some sort of shifting in the time criterion, which would be lengthening the project in order to gain those extra benefits, whilst not exceeding the cost we have. So that might be another example of how an organisation might think about where its priorities lie across those three criteria. Okay, now when I was talking about this in the session, I revisited this project lifecycle with the cash flow overlaid, and the reason for that was that I tried to illustrate how, in different scenarios, depending on the nature of the project, the amount of money spent, so the cost element or the time element, might be critical. So, for example, I think the example I used were Apple and Samsung, both deliver top-end mobile phones. If the new Apple product is being developed, it might be that they have to get that product to market before the Samsung comes out, or, who knows, some of the market share will go to Samsung and they'll lose some of their market share. People will shift onto the Samsung model. Maybe it'll go the other way. So that's what I was trying to illustrate by reiterating this project lifecycle. Okay, in the lecture I talked about the Bradley fighting vehicle and had a little 10-minute clip, quite entertaining clip, and much longer. The whole film is actually available on YouTube. If you look at that greyed out area in the top left hand corner, you can watch the video yourself in your own time. Now, one of the things that came out of that video, and something I mentioned earlier, is scope creep. And I pose the question, it seems to be a bad thing, it seems to be a problem. Budgets increase, projects are hopelessly late, and maybe don't necessarily deliver what was required from the project. So almost always scope creep is seen as a pejorative. However, I wonder whether it is always as problematic as it may seem. I gave the examples of the British Library. The British Library was horrendously late, massively over budget, but if you visit it now, people have forgotten about how late it was and how over budget it was, and are getting massive benefits from the use of this fantastic facility. The reason scope creep occurred there was because of technological changes, which in library use, that books, while still being important, were being surpassed by other electronic means of accessing information. That it wasn't just books, it was general information, and so the British Library had to cater for these changing technologies. The other example I gave you was the Typhoon fighter jet, designed and developed in the Cold War. The scope creep here was changing political conditions. So it was designed in the 1970s and the early 80s, and then at the end of the 1980s the Berlin Wall came down, Glasnost happened, and suddenly its purpose, which was to defend Europe against the Soviet threat, no longer existed. It had to have a new purpose, or possibly a new purpose. And so they went back to the drawing board, redesigned the jet in order to, at great expense and extending the life cycle of the project enormously in order to produce a jet which was much more capable and had a whole variety of different possible uses. And it's been in both these projects, the outcomes have been huge successes. Okay, I mentioned stakeholder theory in the session, and I only touch on this now because one of the things that happens at the early stages of the project is that stakeholders need to be considered in the designing and planning process. I'll revisit stakeholders later on in the module. It's a big subject, a bit, as I said there in the first point, neglected by standard project management standard project management discourse. Nevertheless, a very important subject for all projects. Stakeholders, who are they? They're people or groups of people involved in or affected in some way by the project activities. Often they have very different needs and expectations. The purpose of a business is to try and create as much value as possible for its stakeholders. This means aligning stakeholder interests or trading them off one against the other, identifying which stakeholders are most important. Maybe it's the shareholders of an organisation, maybe it's the end users, maybe it's the consumers, maybe it's all of those. And then, so how do you balance the differing needs of those different stakeholder groups? So stakeholders can be internal or external, they can be end users, they can be interested parties, people who just might be somehow affected in passing by the project. That's particularly the case if the project has some sort of tangible outcome and impact. So, for example, a new building has passers-by who have an interest in the fact the new building is going up, and maybe they don't like it or maybe they do like it. People otherwise affected by the project, and stakeholders can be legitimate, in other words, have some sort of contractual relationship with the organisation delivering the project, or non-legitimate, maybe protesters, or maybe people who have some sort of who are unhappy with the project in some way, but aren't contractually involved in the project. So how do we involve stakeholders? Maybe we involve them in outlining the project definition process. If so, which ones? Maybe we involve them in developing the scope of the project. If so, which ones? Maybe we involve them in project implementation. Again, if so, which ones? And probably who's involved at different stages of the project will vary throughout most project life cycles. Finally, a point which I will pick up later on in the module is about the disruptive influence. Stakeholders tend to try, if they're involved in the project in some way, in the definition, in the scope development, in project implementation, will try to grab or take or pull value to them. This may well be at the expense of others and may involve slowing down the project or adding additional cost to the project as they try to get more value in terms of more scope and more outcomes for them. Okay, so here's a question which I posed. Imagine you're a project manager and you say to yourself, well, I've spoken to the main stakeholders and have developed a feasibility assessment and scope. How do I get these turned into something that looks like a project? The answer is start planning. And so what I'm going to do is, through the rest of this session really, I'll talk about planning and estimating the project. So what do we mean by project planning? Well, the design of the project planning process is to think about the purpose of project planning. What it's about is optimizing the project system, and I really picked this up in session 5. That's part of it. The other part is to avoid future problems in the delivery of the project. In other words, manage the risk. Aspects of project planning include time and resource planning, cost planning, quality planning, and risk analysis. Then there needs to be some sort of control mechanism put in place to then ensure that the project delivery meets the plans. So what's the process involved? Designing or defining the project brief or statement of requirements. This has to determine a number of things. What activities are required? What actually has to be done? Who's going to be responsible for delivering each activity? What's the logic, planning logic? In other words, what has to come first? What comes next? What aspects of the project have to be delivered before other aspects can be delivered? Can certain activities run in parallel? Then also you might want to start thinking about what sort of resources are going to be required. And unless we have this information together, we will have no idea of the time for the project's going to take, how much it's going to cost, and indeed what sort of outcomes we can expect to be delivered by the project. We need to compare this against our objectives, optimize the project, revise the project, re-optimize the project, and this planning process is a very iterative, going backwards and forwards, discussion, debate, all the time absorbing resource. Okay, these can then be used to generate an overall plan against which the project can then be monitored. Hooray. So, what are the key things which happen in planning? We start with a work breakdown structure, and I'm going to finish up on the work breakdown structure and then talk a little bit about estimating at the end. Okay, so we start with the work breakdown structure, then we move on to putting that into starting to develop a network for the various tasks or activities, which might be a critical path method or PERT, and I'll pick up those in the next session, but these get turned into a Gantt chart. We might have milestone charts, some sort of time phase resource budgets. In other words, budget is drawn down cash is drawn down over time for different aspects of the project. Create an S-curve for earned value analysis. EVA stands for earned value analysis, and may include some sort of risk, which could be incorporating PERT, which I'll come on to in the next session. So what's the work breakdown structure? The first stage is to deconstruct large projects into manageable tasks. So work breakdown structures are used in virtually all projects of even a small scale. We start with defining the major functions or areas of the project at the highest level, and then we get more and more details that go down into the structure. It's not, and I underline that point there, it's not a schedule or process for the project. All it's about is saying what are all the things we need to do in order to deliver the project. So that's the question which is being asked. We've got a scope, we need to turn that scope into some sort of series of tasks. How do we do that? What do we need to do? Okay. Later, those tasks will be arranged in some sort of schedule or logic. But at this stage, all we're doing is creating some sort of structure to try and pick up as many of the tasks as possible. It can be functional or physical in terms of breakdown. It can also help with accountability. Who's responsible for each task? What's the cost, time and quality performance targets at all levels of the project organisation? And we use a coding system. So I remind you, the work breakdown structure is not a schedule. And this is the sort of thing you would do. So you start with the project at the top, and then have a series of deliverables, and then sub-deliverables, and so on and so forth, and then develop cost accounts maybe for some of those sub-deliverables, which turn into work packages. So top one, the project, and then we have the major elements comprising project outcome, and then more breakdown, and then groups of work packages can be determined by sub-deliverable for assigning responsibility and monitoring, and then finally identifiable work packages, and then even down to more layers of to specific tasks. And then I gave this example. This example is out of Harvey Mailer's book called Project Management, and it's installing a new computer system. Starts at the top with, that's the project. They'll have 3 broad areas: 1 defining the needs of the project, 2 selecting suppliers, and 3 implementing it. So in this example, that's what's required. And then under 1.2, which is selecting suppliers, they decided that they need to identify the suppliers, shortlist them, and then trial them. And then in terms of 1.2.1, breaking that down to more detail, how do we identify suppliers? Maybe contact the trade association, maybe call suppliers for details, confirm their suitability. Then you could go into more detail still if you wanted to. And what we're doing here is getting to specific activities that need to be carried out in order to deliver the project. You can also have process breakdown structures. These are sometimes used in projects, particularly for process-oriented kinds of project, like software projects and those sort of things. The sort of approach we might use is something like this, where you can see there is some sort of logic in the process, but then these will be quite possibly be reiterated, particularly for software projects where part of the project is delivered, then another part, using maybe an agile project management system. And then we have more detailed activities under each of those broad topics, and then more detailed activities under those. Okay, so what level of detail do we go down to? Well, we need to try and identify as many activities as possible to start devising the network and the planning logic for the project. The problem is excessive detail is costly. We're spending more time, effort. It fosters focusing on departmental outcomes, but can produce huge amounts of unproductive paperwork and thinking concern about the project. And it's eating up time, which is maybe a major issue for the project. Insufficient detail is also costly. There's a lack of focus on the goals, wasted effort on non-essential activities later on in the planning process. So getting the balance there right is really important and difficult. Okay, so here's another question. I've assessed the feasibility, worked out the scope, talked to the stakeholders, and worked out what needs to be done by developing a work breakdown structure. So how do I work out how long the project will actually take and how much it will cost? The answer is start estimating. So what we can do is start to estimate times and costs. Now this is important as the next step in project planning, because what we need to do is work out how long each activity is going to be and what the resource required for each activity might be in order to start putting that into some sort of planning logic. So the aim is to predict the most likely cost and duration of the project by putting together all the detailed aspects. Estimates improve with more information: scope, organisation, time and cost data, risk identification and management. The requirements are to predict the most probable cost, the most probable time scale, establish a forecast of capital expenditure, which is the classic S-curve which you find in all projects, which is expenditure over the duration of the project life cycle. It involves stating all assumptions and what's excluded from the process, and then that estimate has to be communicated both primarily up to the funders and project sponsors and stakeholders, key stakeholders. I put there as a science or art. In some ways it's a science. There's lots of scientific aspects involved in good estimation, but there's also a kind of level of art. There's a lot of guesswork sometimes. You're trying to base decision without actually carrying out the task. It's difficult to say precisely how much a task will cost, or for that matter, how long it's likely to take. Some of the factors influencing estimation: the planning horizon, in what sort of distance, how far into the future are we trying to plan, what is the project deadline, when do we need to start the project in order to get it finished on time, the skills and competencies of the people involved in the organisation. Do we have project management skills? Do we have knowledge of previous projects which we can draw upon to help estimate the current project? The way the project is structured and designed, the amount of slack or padding or float sometimes called, or contingency which might be given to the project. What the culture of the project is. Is it a top-down driven culture, or is it more of an egalitarian culture? Other factors might be included: downtime, availability of resources to make decisions, and and start to help decide how much activities are going to cost and how long they'll take, holidays, legal aspects, all sorts of things. Okay, so the types of costs which might be important are labour costs, materials costs, equipment costs. Those are all aspects you might have in projects, and other costs as well. You also have overhead costs, running the project management team, the project office, and also general and administrative overhead costs. So the processes are: determine the responsibilities. Often several people are drawn upon, maybe even several representatives from different organisations to help establish estimates. The estimates are based on normal conditions, so assuming consistent inflation and assuming no major political upheavals or anything like that. We need to select time units and be consistent with them. So if you can base your planning on a weekly basis, then you stick to weeks no matter how long the project is. If it's monthly, then you stick to months. There needs to be some sort of independence in the estimating from other tasks. So try to get independent people involved in estimating the project. Often within project management organisations, there'll be a separate estimating department. Contingencies need to be built into the estimates, and maybe some risk assessment has to be carried out to assist stakeholders and refine their expectations. Okay, so I've got some examples of estimating techniques. Many of these are very similar. I mean, analogous comparisons is looking at previous projects which are similar to the project we're carrying out now and saying, well, if that hospital costs that much, then this hospital will cost a similar amount. Comparisons with exceptions, so maybe that hospital was built in a rural area and this one's going to be built in an urban area, so we may make some allowance for that. Parametric estimating, so building up project costs and estimates from and time estimates from different elements of previous projects. Cost engineering, possibly, where we go down to basic first principles and say, okay, well, we've got all the activities in front of us. Let's work out the detailed cost for every single activity, the detailed time estimates for every single activity, and then put those all together to create a cost and time for the project. Maybe we use forecasts. What sort of return can we get in the project, and how might that impact on our cost and time estimates? Possibly synthetic estimates or learning curve effects, such as if we've got repeatable elements in the project, maybe the first element will take more, we can assume will take more time and cost more, and then subsequent ones where the project manager and the project team have learned from the first element, they can repeat and repeat and repeat repeatable elements of the project and get faster and reduce the costs. Often I think there's a lot of wishful thinking in this. So wishful thinking, what we really love the project to be, what we really want the project to be in terms of time and cost. Fleifberg and others have come up with this idea of design by deception. So I think I put a paper on Canvas about this. There's lots and lots of research into this now. Fleifberg started it all really, where he argues that effectively either somebody with a vested interest in a project going ahead, a consultant maybe, or a project sponsor or a function within the organisation, deceives other parts of the organisation or deceives the project sponsor about how much the project's going to cost, how long the project will take in order to get the project going ahead in the first instance. That's suggesting a purposeful deception. You could also argue that sometimes people deceive themselves. They deceive themselves through partly wishful thinking, but essentially as a multiple self-deception across the different stakeholders in the project, so that they all get the project going ahead. Okay, so some takeaway points from this particular session. First thing we need to think about is developing the project concept, which is essentially a strategic process. It's translation of strategy into some kind of project plan. We need to think about how the objectives are going to be measured. Are they strategic? Are they operational? Probably both in reality. And what the priorities are. And maybe which priorities we focus on. Think about project scope and scope creep. What are the implications of this? Maybe we get more value out of the final delivered project. Maybe this will kill the project. Maybe it could even kill the organisation if the the scope creeps too much. Who are the stakeholders and how are they going to be involved? Are we going to involve them at all? If so, which stakeholders are we going to be involved at different stages of the definition and planning process? Once this has all been done, then we can start planning, which is about work, breakdown structures, and then time. I've got cost estimating there. Also, time estimating is important as well. So, next session will be we draw upon Chapter 6 in particular, but also Appendix 7.1 for PERT. And you need to think next time about how can projects be scheduled. Can I competently produce a simple activity in the arrow or activity on the node network? Do I understand PERT, which is Program Evaluation and Review Technique? Thank you.